Shalom, shalom. We would like to begin. Thank you. This is a very tight crowd this morning, and we're happy that it's so. This is another one of the lovely symposia that the Dan David Prize Project, it's a whole empire by now, is hosting at Tel Aviv University in association with Tel Aviv University, and in fact, as special guests this time of the Faculty of Humanities and the Faculty of Arts at Tel Aviv University. So we are two faculties that have come together to host this wonderful symposium this morning. Our guests here are the two recipients of the Dan David Prize of 2010, namely Ms. Margaret Atwood, sitting up here with us. Please. And Mr. Amitav Ghosh. And good morning to Mrs. Gabi David. Who is a major, she has an invitation, she has a place. Mrs. David is a major force in the Dan David Prize Project, and we are also happy to have with us Mr. Ariel David, a newcomer into the Dan David Prize Project. Another very special guest we have here this morning, except all of you, thank you, is His Excellency the Ambassador of India. Who is not a first, and other people from the embassy, thank you. And His Excellency this is not his first visit at Tel Aviv University, and we have always had extraordinary relationships, the university that is, with the embassy of India and with your attaché, cultural and so on, year after year, attaché after attaché. And I must say that the Indian embassy or your foreign minister chooses attachés that have very special wives. They're usually PhD people who have done work in feminism. This has been so. So there is something to look forward to in this very exciting relationship with Your Excellency. Thank you for being here this morning. So we have a very busy morning, and I will just without much ado say that we are going to have the first session is a reading with introduction, a reading session, and one by one you will hear the introductions by my colleagues here at the Presidium, and after a short break we will have a symposium with our two honored guests of the Dan David Prize and also Israeli authors. We shall see who sits at the round table. My last sentence is that personally I am a professor of Hebrew literature and literature in general, and between you and I, the novel is absolutely my favorite form of art. So I am very excited to hear and to understand more about the novel from the inside. Namely, I never wrote a word in my life in that sense. So I'm always the one who looks from the outside in to discover myself and to see what I can take away from your writing. And now I shall see how you are in there, perhaps to discover me and your other readers, because you are here because your readers asked you to be here. You are here despite many types of gagging that goes on today. You are here despite that because as artists you want to have a dialogue with your readers, in this case, with your audience, with your very excited, avid, the people who want to hear more about you and to learn more about you and to understand more about where you're coming from and how you put yourself in there to come out to them. And I appreciate that very much in the very difficult personal circumstances that the general circumstances have put you in. I appreciate your coming here, and your coming to Tel Aviv University is not of no significance in these days. So now, without much ado, Professor Shirley Sharon Zisser, the head of the English department, English and American Studies department. Thank you.
Professor Hannah Neve, Dean of the Faculty of the Arts, our most distinguished guests, Amitav Ghosh, Margaret Atwood, with the greatest living writers in English language, and justly selected as Dan David Prize laureates for the year 2010, Professor Hannah Wertnesher, Dr. Heda Ben Basat, head of the Porter School of Cultural Studies, His Excellency of India, members of the Dan David family, colleagues, students, honorable guests. I am most honored and humbled to have been asked to say a few words of greeting at the opening of today's symposium, in which we will have the privilege of listening to contemporary writers of the highest quality, who write in two languages, English and Hebrew. The one a mosaic, a conglomerate of tongues, sometimes quintessentially unfamiliar to one another, whose body of letters carries memory traces of battles and feuds, religious wars and voyages of colonization, alongside some of the most exquisite poetry ever composed, and which has now become the language of globalization. The other, an ancient language, which the prophet Isaiah speaks of as one of the strange tongues spoken by God to his people. Strange not least because its combinatory structures renders neologisms felicitous, and is hence constitutively a language of renewal, such as phenomenalized in its own history of resuscitation in the late 19th and early 20th century, a great part of which was literary history. Today we have the privilege of listening to illustrious writers in these two magnificent languages, discuss the ways in which the practice of writing in these languages, including their own, has responded to, sometimes treated, 20th century, much of which can only be described as involving the unprecedented emergence of sheer catastrophe, beyond what any dialectics can account for. Writing in Occidental culture has always been inextricably intertwined with disaster. From Virgil's Et in Arcadia ego, inscribing the indelible presence of death even within the realm of pastorality, to the dismemberment of Orpheus by the Maenads, which functions as the precondition for poetic song, to the melodious voice of the nightingale that is the effect of the rape and murder of Philomel. The foundations of Western poetics recurrently insist on things having been lost, brutally lost, as what enables literary rememoration. In a myth reverberating throughout the rhetorical tradition, the very founding of the art of rememoration is attributed to the poet Simonides, sole survivor of and witness to a catastrophe which not only destroyed his peers but mangled their body beyond recognition, disabling the possibility of burial and the rites of mourning, which are among the sine qua non of civilization and hence of speech. And yet we speak in the retroaction of the lived experience of the transgressed limit of what had been the sine qua non of civilization and speech, the limit of unforeseen eruptions of the real, whose historiographic label might be the 20th century. Beyond this limit of industrial genocide, technologized terrorism, nuclear bombs eclipsing nuclear medicine, which itself falls prey to increasing standardization, evaluation, the tyranny of the cipher, and of collective labels that might make subjectivity obsolete. Technique, the making that is textual. Whether Simonidian mnemonics or Spinozian amo intellectualis Dei, other than the love of the universality of the signifier of words, is no longer a tenable response from the side of the subject, the side of language. No longer tenable, not because any moral imperative dictates that this should be. For the 20th century is also the name of the epoch of the failure, as well as the rise of many grand ideologies. But because it is the literary effects of the 20th century as an era of traumatism that attest to this. Attest to this in new forms of the novel, which can accommodate words cut in two by the noise of the plane engine, as Virginia Woolf puts it in a novel whose destiny is marked by global war. which can accommodate characters who, no longer respecting Aristotelian unities or even formalist categorizations, shift genders, sexualities, ethnicities, making languages intersect and interact in ways which do not cease to surprise. It is such effects of fiction that render the whole of dramatism, whose temporal marker is the 20th century, what it is, at the same time as they render their authors, perhaps more than ever before, as Shakespeare puts it through Hamlet, the very chronicles of the time. Not because they report on an age, but because they fashion the chronotops, the narrative time shapes that constitute what this age will have been. Today we're proud to host two of the most outstanding chronicles of our time, Dan David laureates Margaret Atwood and Amitav Ghosh. I wish to extend them the warmest welcome on behalf of Tel Aviv University's Department of English and American Studies, and I'm happy to pass the podium to my friend and colleague, Dr. Heda Ben-Bassat, who will introduce the first of them, distinguished Canadian author Margaret Atwood.
Good morning, all. I'll try to be brief. It is. You here? No? It is a great honor and pleasure for me to open the first part of today's symposium, Contemporary Writers Portray the 20th Century, and to introduce the first speaker, this year's Dan David Prize Laureate, Margaret Atwood. Ms. Atwood is one of Canada's most esteemed writers and has published numerous collections of poems, novels, short stories, children's books, and volumes of non-fictional essays. From the early 1970s, her work has greatly contributed to the emergence of a specific national Canadian identity and to the flowering of a Canadian literary production. Fiction, she has argued, and I quote, is one of the few forms left through which we may examine our society in its typical aspects, through which we can see ourselves and the ways in which we behave towards each other, through which we can judge others and ourselves. Survival, her 1972 provocative book on Canadian literature, investigates the centrality of literary production in the process of self-fashioning in a country which, as in Atwood's words, was until recently dominated by one imperial power and is now dominated by another. Imperialism, colonialism, and victimization, whether suffered by Canadians deeming themselves exiled in their own land, or conversely inflicted by them on marginal elements within their own society, have been central to Atwood's work, from the early collections of poems entitled Power Politics in 1971, and her novel Surfacing and Life Before Men during the 70s, and to her most recent dystopias. Characteristically, she relates to nationalistic awakening and the emergence of second-wave feminism in her country as, and I quote, part of a large issue, human dignity. That is what Canadian nationalism is about and what feminism is about. They are part of the same vision. In the second part of the 20th century, perhaps more urgently than ever before, Atwood implies, the writer's responsibility is to foreground this vision, to portray humankind in its non-homogenized but rather diversified experience, to explore the intricate relations between individuals and the power structures that threaten to subject or subjugate them. The writer, she observes in her book of essays, Second Words, and I quote again, functions as a kind of truth-teller, and the novel is a moral instrument. Moral, she goes on to say, implies political, and the novelist sees a connection between politics and the moral sense. This intertwining of moral and political is evident in Atwood's three dystopias, The Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985, Oryx and Craig, published in 2003, and more recently, The Year of the Flood, published in 2009, which she defines as speculative novels, rather than science fiction, since they contemplate possible models of the future based on scenarios from present realities. Writing within the tradition that spans from Thomas More to Jonathan Swift and George Orwell, she presents the reader with mirrors held up to life in the 20th century, not merely in order to reflect human nature, but also to delineate potential mutations. They are meant as cautionary tales about such contemporary situations of crisis as the threat of fundamentalism and totalitarian regimes, widespread environmental catastrophe, ecological disasters, and the abuse of scientific knowledge. Through her fictive narrators, who tell their stories mainly to themselves, it is Atwood who constructs for us, her readers, fables of our time. And now I think it is time to listen to some of our fables. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Margaret Atwood.
Thank you very much. It's one of the more interesting and complex experiences of my life to have come here. And we'll talk about that later, just exactly how complex it is, which you all know anyway, but you might be interested in our possibly somewhat naive impressions. Right now, however, I'm going to read from two novels. One is called The Blind Assassin, and when I was starting to write this, I set out to write the 20th century through the time periods that had been lived by my grandmother and my mother. Both of those people were far too nice to be put into a novel by me. So the narrator is not my mother and not my grandmother, but she has lived through the same time period. She was born in 1916. Therefore, through the First World War, through the Depression, through the Second World War, and when we hear from her, she is in her 80s and she has a heart condition. She's not going to be alive very much longer, so she has begun to narrate her life. Last night I watched the Weather Channel, as is my habit. Everywhere in the world there are floods, roiling brown water, bloated cows floating by, survivors huddled on rooftops, thousands have drowned, global warming is held accountable, people must stop burning things up, it is said, gasoline, oil, whole forests, but they won't stop. Greed and hunger lash them on as usual. Where was I? I turned back the page. The war is still raging. Raging is what they used to say for wars, still do for all I know. But on this page, a fresh, clean page, I will cause the war to end. I alone, with a stroke of my black plastic pen. All I have to do is write 1918, November 11, Armistice Day. There, it's over. The guns are silent. The men who are left alive look up at the sky, their faces grimed, their clothing sodden. They climb out of their foxholes and filthy burrows. Both sides feel they have lost. In the towns, in the countryside, here and across the ocean, the church bells all begin to ring. I can remember that, the bells ringing. It's one of my first memories. It was so strange. The air was so full of sound, and at the same time, so empty. Reenie took me outside to hear. There were tears running down her face. Thank God, she said. The day was chilly. There was frost on the fallen leaves, a skim of ice on the lily pond. I broke it with a stick. Where was Mother? Father had been wounded at the Somme, but he'd recovered from that and had been made a second lieutenant. He was wounded again at Vimy Ridge, though not severely, and was made a captain. He was wounded again at Bourlon Wood, this time worse. It was while he was recovering in England that the war ended. He missed the jubilant welcome for the returning troops at Halifax, the victory parades and so forth, but there was a special reception in Port Ticonderoga just for him. The train stopped. Cheering broke out. Hands reached up to help him down, then hesitated. He emerged. He had one good eye and one good leg. His face was gaunt, seemed fanatical. Farewells can be shattering, but returns are surely worse. Solid flesh can never live up to the bright shadow cast by its absence. Time and distance blur the edges. Then suddenly, the beloved has arrived, and it's noon with its merciless light, and every spot and pore and wrinkle and bristle stands clear. Thus my mother and my father. How could either of them atone to the other for having changed so much, for failing to be what was expected? How could there not be grudges? Grudges held silently and unjustly because there was nobody to blame, or nobody you could put your finger on. The war was not a person. Why blame a hurricane? There they stand on the railway platform. The town band plays, brass mostly. He's in his uniform. His medals are like holes shot in the cloth, through which the dull gleam of his real metal body can be seen. Beside him, invisible, are his brothers, the two lost boys, the ones he feels he has lost. My mother is there in her best dress, a belted affair with lapels and a hat with a crisp ribbon. She smiles tremulously. Neither knows quite what to do. The newspaper camera catches them in its flash. They stare, as if surprised in crime. My father is wearing a black patch over his right eye. His left eye glares balefully. Underneath the patch, not yet revealed, is a web of scarred flesh, his missing eye, the spider. Chase Air Hero returns, the paper will trumpet. That's another thing. My father is now the heir, which to say he's fatherless as well as brotherless. The kingdom is in his hands. It feels like mud. Did my mother cry? It's possible. They must have kissed awkwardly, as if at a box social, one for which he'd bought the wrong ticket. This wasn't what he'd remembered, this efficient, careworn woman with a pince-nez like some maiden aunt's glinting on a silver chain around her neck. They were now strangers, and it must have occurred to them they always had been. How harsh the light was, how much older they'd become. There was no trace of the young man who'd once knelt so deferentially on the ice to lace up her skates, or of the young woman who'd sweetly accepted this homage. To give you a little background, this is the first Great War. It was a war that was very important for Canada, although not so important for the United States, because Canada went into that war as soon as it began. The United States went into it just before it ended. Therefore, Canada lost a great percentage of its young men. Because it had the regimental system, it meant that regiments were raised from a town or an area, and all of those young men went into the regiment together, and when they went into one of these amazing slaughters of the First World War, it would mean that all of those young men would be wiped out in one day. So the town would receive a telegram, everybody would be gone. And that is why everywhere you go in Canada, in all of these towns, you will see a war memorial of some kind dating from that period. Part of the novel concerns the great debates over what to put on those war memorials, which took place in every town. Some of them didn't actually put up these statues with the goddess holding wreath. Some of them put up, it being Canada, some of them put up skating arenas, memorial skating arenas. The other thing I can tell you about that war is that the iconic poem of the war, which is called In Flanders Fields, about the poppies, was written by a Canadian poet, and that's where the wearing of poppies came from. And since everything has a ripple effect, it affected the cover of my most recent book, The Year of the Flood, because in North America they put a poppy on it for reasons that had nothing to do with that war. But in England they said, if we put a poppy on a book cover, it's always about World War I. So they had to have a different cover. So that is a chain of circumstances, and if you really asked me to, I could recite that poem off by heart, because we all had to learn it in school.
So will you?
So will I. Maybe not just now. So did Americans have to learn, of a certain generation, I expect. Yours, yeah. So that is the extreme past in that novel. Now I'm going to read from one about the near future, and that novel is called Oryx and Crake. And in Oryx and Crake, we have a male narrator all the way through. Before I wrote this novel, everybody was always asking me, why do you always have these women characters all the time? I did have some men, but they didn't notice those. And as soon as I wrote this one, with no mistakes possible, it is a man all the way through, they then said, why did you choose a male narrator? So it's hard to win that one. And this narrator is called Jimmy, and he has renamed himself Snowman. And he has grown up in what is in essence a gated compound, because in the future we have gated compounds where all of the scientific and technical people have been sequestered to prevent industrial espionage and brain stealing. And he has grown up inside this one, and outside it are the people who aren't part of these enterprises, and they range everywhere from people living in kind of suburbs to people living in extreme slums. But it's considered too dangerous for the people inside to go outside, so the only contact he has had with the outside is looking at it through the windows of a sealed train. So he's led a sheltered existence. Unfortunately, he's not good at math, which means that within the sheltered existence, he's rather low on the totem pole. So that when he leaves high school and goes to college, he doesn't go to one of the elite colleges where they study technology and science and bioengineering. He has to go to a lowly arts academy where the food is really terrible and everything's falling apart. Sorry, it's the future. Because I always liked Martha Graham, I called it the Martha Graham Academy. Whereas the one that his friend Craig goes to is named after Watson and Crick. So at this point in the novel, Jimmy's great friend, who is quite a strange and logical person, has created a new race of human beings who don't have any of the drawbacks of ours. So the problems that are ours will never be theirs. For instance, they are extreme vegetarians. Not only that, they can eat leaves. Their digestive system has been altered back towards that of rabbits. I won't go into the details. They have been given built-in sunblock. I would like that. They don't have to develop agriculture because of the leaves. They don't have to develop clothing because of the built-in sunblock. And a feature I really like, they have built-in insect repellent. So be very necessary if you don't have to wear clothes. So they will never develop, for instance, cotton farming, the fashion industry, getting your clothes made in China, or any of those other things. You don't need them. They have a feature which I like very much. My brother, the biologist, questioned it, but I stand by it. They can purr. And the reason they can purr like a cat is that apparently the frequency with which cats purr is very close to the frequency that we have in ultrasound that we use on bone healing. One of the theories as to why cats purr, because they purr not only when they're pleased but also when they're in pain. One of the theories is that it's a self-healing thing, and if you have a cat, you will notice that when you are ill, the cat will get up and purr over the part of you that is afflicted. Isn't this true? Not only that, when someone comes into the house who doesn't like cats, the cat will march over to that person. My theory is it's trying to help. They can purr. But one of the very, very best things about them is they will never suffer from broken hearts, because like other mammals, but unlike human beings, their mating season is intermittent and clearly signaled by a color change in certain parts, which I won't go into, but study the baboon. So they have this special feature, which means that nobody ever suffers from a broken romance. And I think this would be a great thing. It would reduce human suffering no end. So there they are. They're rather communal in these practices, and they also, their children grow up very quickly, so they don't have to spend all of this time with the teenagers. There's no more, can I borrow the car? None of that. So there they are. He's created these people ostensibly as a series of models that people could then get the features they wanted. So they're sort of like a furniture model shop, but then having created them, he's then proceeded to wipe out most of the rest of the human race because he felt that his model is superior. And what do you think? I think it's something to be said for that. Anyway, Jimmy Snowman has been made their guardian. He has to take care of them. They don't read. They don't read yet. They don't read. He hoped to get rid of symbolic thinking in them, but he couldn't manage that. And he hoped to get rid of music, not being a fan of it, but he could not eliminate the music either. So in fact they sing. And now they are starting to get rather curious. Snowman isn't very good as a Boy Scout type of person. So he's been living on tin cans, but those are running out. He's going to have to do something about the food problem. He's had to invent a theology for these people, because once you have a grammar that includes a past tense, you're going to have a theology. It's inevitable. What happened before me? Well, what happened before that? What happened before that? Where did it all come from? Snowman sits in his tattered sheet, hunched at the edge of the trees, where grass and vetch and sea grapes merge into sand. Now that it's cooler, he feels less dejected. Also, he's hungry. There's something to be said for hunger. At least it lets you know you're still alive. Across the clearing to the south comes a rabbit, hopping, listening, pausing to nibble at the grass with its gigantic teeth. It glows in the dusk, a greenish glow filched from the iridocytes of a deep-sea jellyfish in some long-ago experiment. In the half-light, the rabbit looks soft and almost translucent, like a piece of Turkish delight, as if you could suck off its fur like sugar. Even in Snowman's boyhood, there were luminous green rabbits, though they weren't this big, and they hadn't yet slipped their cages and bred with the wild population and become a nuisance. This one has no fear of him, though it fills him with carnivorous desires. He longs to whack it with a rock, tear it apart with his bare hands, then cram it into his mouth, fur and all. But rabbits belong to the children of Oryx, and are sacred to Oryx herself, and it would be a bad idea to offend the women. It was a bad idea. It's his own fault. He must have been stupefied with drink when he was laying down the laws. He should have made rabbits edible by himself at any rate, but he can't change that now. He can almost hear Oryx laughing at him with indulgent, faintly malicious delight. The children of Oryx, the children of Crake, he'd had to think of something. Get your story straight, keep it simple, don't falter. This used to be the expert advice given by lawyers to criminals in the dock. Crake made the bones of the children of Crake out of the coral on the beach, and then he made their flesh out of a mango. But the children of Oryx hatched out of an egg, a giant egg laid by Oryx herself. Actually, she laid 2 eggs, one full of animals and birds and fish, and the other one full of words. But the egg full of words hatched first, and the children of Crake had already been created by then, and they'd eaten up all the words because they were hungry, and so there were no words left over when the second egg hatched out. And that is why the animals can't talk. Internal consistency is best. Snowman learned this earlier in his life when lying had posed more of a challenge for him. Now, even when he's caught in a minor contradiction, he can make it stick because these people trust him. He's the only one left who'd known Crake face to face, so he can lay claim to the inside track. Above his head flies the invisible banner of Crakedom, of Crakiness, of Crakehood, hallowing all he does. The first star appears. Starlight, star bright, he says, some grade school teacher, big bum Sally. Now, close your eyes right up tight, tighter, really tight. There! See the wishing star? Now we will all wish for the thing we want the very, very most of all in the whole wide world. But, shh, don't tell anyone, or the wish won't come true. Snowman screws his eyes shut, pushes his fists into them, clenches his entire face. There's the wishing star, all right, it's blue. I wish I may, I wish I might, he says, have the wish I wish tonight. Fat chance. Oh, Snowman, why are you talking to no one, says a voice. Snowman opens his eyes. 3 of the older children are standing just out of reach, regarding him with interest. They must have crept up on him in the dusk. I'm talking to Crake, he says. Why are you talking to him about stars? What are you telling to Crake, oh Snowman? What indeed, thinks Snowman. When dealing with indigenous peoples, says the book in his head, you must attempt to respect their traditions and confine your explanations to simple concepts that can be understood within the context of their belief systems. Some earnest aid worker in a khaki jungle outfit with netting under the arms and 100 pockets, condescending, self-righteous cow, thinks she's got all the answers. He'd known girls like that at college. If she were here, she'd need a whole new take on Indigenous. I was telling him, says Snowman, that you ask too many questions. He holds his watch to his ear, and he's telling me that if you don't stop doing that, you'll be toast. Please, Snowman, what is toast? Another error, Snowman thinks. He should avoid arcane metaphors. Toast, he says, is something very, very bad. It's so bad, I can't even describe it. Now it's your bedtime. Go away. What is toast? Says Snowman to himself once they've run off. Toast is when you take a piece of bread. What is bread? Bread is when you take some flour. What is flour? We'll skip that part. It's too complicated. Bread is something you can eat, made from a ground-up plant and shaped like a stone. You cook it. Please, why do you cook it? Why don't you just eat the plant? Never mind that part. Pay attention. You cook it, and then you cut it into slices. And you put a slice into a toaster, which is a metal box that heats up with electricity. What is electricity? Don't worry about that. While the slice is in the toaster, you get out the butter. Butter is a yellow grease made from the mammary glands of... Skip the butter. So, the toaster turns the slice of bread black on both sides with smoke coming out. And then this toaster shoots the slice up into the air and it falls onto the floor. Forget it, says Snowman. Let's try again. Toast was a pointless invention from the Dark Ages. Toast was an implement of torture that caused all those subjected to it to regurgitate in verbal form the sins and crimes of their past lives. Toast was a ritual item devoured by fetishists in the belief that it would enhance their kinetic and sexual powers. Toast cannot be explained by any rational means. Toast is me. I am toast.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Amitav Ghosh, one of our most distinguished and innovative novelists. Ghosh's writing offers a panoramic treatment of the 20th century, post-colonial, transnational, and the many identities produced by the collision of languages and cultures. Ghosh's worlds do not tolerate boundaries. His writings are global and cosmopolitan, at the same time that they brilliantly evoke the particular. Displacement and exile, lives torn between India, Burma, England, and elsewhere, families torn by the violence and turmoil of colonial rule and post-colonial dispossession, a globe racked by 2 world wars and their ancillary bloodshed, have been integral to Ghosh's work from his earliest novels, The Circle of Reason and The Shadow Lines, through his most recent. His fiction is distinguished equally by its precise, beautifully rendered depictions of characters and settings, and by its sweeping sense of history against the background of violent dislocations of peoples and regimes. In tracing the life story of Rajkumar, a self-made young man in the teak and rubber trades, The Glass Palace spans a century of Indian and Burmese history, British rule, and Japanese invasion. In circumstances of war, observes Ghosh, as well as in situations of revolution, mass evacuations, and forced population movements, nobody has the choice of stepping away from history. A great historical novel in the grand European tradition and reminiscent of Tolstoy in its mixture of dispassion and compassion, The Glass Palace portrays the lives of individuals across generations, but may be at its best when it chronicles the unmaking of nation rather than the reverse. The impact of Western science and technology on non-Western worlds and the entanglement of politics and environment often lie at the center of Ghosh's work, as in the Calcutta chromosome, for example, where turn-of-the-century malaria research and Hindu beliefs about transmigrating souls intersect with modern ideas about genetics and cloning. The Hungry Tide chronicles conflicts of culture, class, and worldview through the interlocking stories of an American-born environmentalist of Indian extraction, the illiterate native who becomes her guide, and a Delhi professional who acts as her interpreter. It would take far too long to mention all of his works, and I won't. I know you want to hear his voice. A few words only about his most recent novel. Although it is set in the Indian Ocean at the outset of the 19th century opium wars between the British and the Chinese, Sea of Poppies forecasts the 20th century in its exploration of the crisscrossing tales of a free mulatto American who takes to sea, an Indian peasant married to an opium addict and rescued from Sati, a disgraced Raja, and the orphaned daughter of a French botanist in India. While acknowledging the influence of canonical European and American writers he much admires, Balzac, Conrad, Dickens, Melville, Ghosh refashions the realist novel to include dimensions of history that his predecessors repressed or ignored, even as he expands its generic capabilities. By bringing the languages of history, science, commerce, politics, religion, and anthropology to his writing, Ghosh has ushered the novel into the 21st century with great artistry and wisdom, with empathy and ethics. I now turn over the podium to Indian, Bengali, New Yorker, global writer, and celebrator of life, Amitav Ghosh.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for that lovely introduction. It's a sort of nightmare for writers when they have to follow a reading like Margaret's. However, I did once have to read after Michael Moore, and that was really, really difficult. And that was actually in Canada, in Vancouver. But anyway, I'm actually going to read from from a book that Hannah didn't mention. I was going to read from Sea of Poppies, but then I thought I actually would like to read from this one. It's called In an Antique Land, and it's in a way it's one of the reasons why I'm here today. In an Antique Land it's actually a kind of, it's part autobiography and it's part biography. The autobiographical part came about this way. When I was 21, I applied for a scholarship, as most young Indians do, and I happened to get it. And it was a scholarship to Oxford in the Department of Anthropology. And after I'd been there for a year, one of my teachers there said, "Well, why don't you stay and do a PhD?" So, I thought, well, why not? I mean, I can travel somewhere and live there, and it was something I really wanted to do, to travel somewhere. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And then I thought, but where am I going to go? Because, the other students who were doing anthropology, they were going off to Polynesia or, wherever their fancy took them. But I didn't feel somehow that I wanted to have that kind of randomness, about choosing where to go. And I was really conflicted about thinking, well, where do I want to go? Because I certainly I did want to be outside India. I did want to travel, because, my great heroes were, many of them were travel writers, like Naipaul and so on. And one day I was in one of the libraries at Oxford, and I came across a book. It was a book called the Letters of Medieval Jewish Traders. Now, it's not a book that you would think that one would pounce upon. And you can imagine that, I picked it up and I started looking through it, and I came across this letter by a Jewish trader of the 12th century, a man called Abraham ben Yiju. And the letter was about how he had taken his, he'd lived in India for like 20 or 30 years, from about 1138 till about 1158 or so, and how he had returned to Cairo with an Indian slave who went by the name of Bama. It's said in this book. And this struck me as such an interesting thing, such an interesting and such a deep historical connection with India. And I thought to myself, well, I'll go to Egypt. So I did. I went to Egypt. I lived there for a while, and later, many years later, after I'd written my first 2 novels, I decided that I would write about my experience of living in this little village in Egypt. And it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, they had certainly never seen a Hindu before. They had there were some Christians nearby, but they were not in this village. So it was a completely Muslim village. I was the only non-Muslim to be anywhere in the area. And it was a strange experience, in some ways incredibly enriching, in some ways difficult. So I felt I had to write about it. So when I started writing about it, I felt also that I had to talk about what brought me into this story. And that was Abraham ben Yiju. So I decided I would also write about Abraham ben Yiju and him traveling to India as a Middle Easterner. So I started looking for Abraham ben Yiju's letters. And that was when I discovered, to my utter horror, that only one of his letters had been translated. All the rest were written in Judeo-Arabic and had not been translated. Now, many of you will know this language, Judeo-Arabic. It was the language of Maimonides, and it was one of the great languages of the Middle Ages. It is actually colloquial Arabic written in the Hebrew script. So suddenly there I am thinking that if I'm going to write this, I have to learn Judeo-Arabic. Now, I'm terrible at many things. I'm terrible at mathematics. I can never, chess even I'm no good at. But I'm good at scripts because, as Indians we grow up with many scripts and many different things. So I thought, well, maybe I can pick this up. And by this time I was speaking colloquial Arabic completely fluently. So I thought, well, it's a question of accustoming my eye to the Hebrew script and learning the paleographic techniques of deciphering it. So I thought, well, let me give it a shot. And at that point, I met someone, Professor Mark Cohen, who teaches at Princeton. And he was incredibly helpful and encouraging. And he said, yes, just try it, maybe, So off I went to Oxford, where there's a wonderful Geniza connection. And I went, it was to Cambridge. My wife reminds me, we went together. Well, we were just married. So off we went to Cambridge. And I walked into this room. There's this wonderful room called the Geniza Room. It's called the Taylor Schechter Collection in Cambridge. I walked in there. I was the only person without a yarmulke. And, nobody who's, at that point, there was only one person who's not Jewish who'd ever looked at these documents. No Indian historian had ever looked at them, even though there are absolute trove of information on medieval Indian history. So I started working, and then I had a very peculiar experience. One very senior Israeli scholar came to me one day and he said, I believe you're working on these documents. So I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, you have no right to work on these documents. So I said, what do you mean, no right? So he said, no, you have no right. And he said, if you continue doing this work, I will destroy your career. In those words, he said to me. I mean, it's not something you often hear. People saying, I will destroy your career. And he said it to me literally, I will destroy your career. So I thought, oh yeah, you want to destroy my career? We'll see about that. And actually, at that point, several Israeli scholars actually, came to my defense. And they, Menachem ben Sasson, whom many of you will know, was very supportive. And I felt a deep sense of obligation to them, because, this other scholar was a very senior person, and, they could have paid a price, but they didn't care at all, and they really rallied around me, and really, at many stages, helped me with this work, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude to them. Anyway, so I did go ahead. I did persevere with Judeo-Arabic. I did learn Judeo-Arabic. I've since forgotten it. I mean, I can still, if I applied my mind to it.
One sentence.
In Judeo-Arabic? Oh, but it would be just Arabic. I mean, spoken, it's just colloquial Arabic. So it's no different. It's just the orthography that's different, So I did work on these, and it was an amazing thing. At a certain point, I was working with these in the Taylor Schechter collection. You actually work with the actual pieces of paper. I had the actual pieces of paper in my hand, 800 years old. And with the ink, you could see the ink. He's writing about Mangalore in the 12th century. You could feel the ink, you could feel the paper.
That's why you want to do this for your career. Did he give you a reason? Did he explain why it was written?
He did. He was himself editing these documents, and he felt that my work would interfere. But he had been editing these documents apparently for 20 years. So that was why Menachem ben Sasson and everyone said, well, no, you must go ahead and do it. And look, I mean... No, it had nothing to do with sacredness. They're all mercantile texts, merchants' letters. So, I felt Abraham ben Yiju went to what is now my country. And, he was dealing with that is a part of my heritage too. How can someone tell me what my heritage is? No one's got a right to do that, I mean, that's where you start creating these boundaries, saying, this is so-and-so's heritage, that is so-and-so's heritage, and I just don't accept that. So, I'm going to read to you a little bit of this book from, about the life of Abraham ben Yiju. It was probably in the mid-1140s or so that Ben Yiju began to think seriously of returning from India to the Middle East. At about that time, after many years of silence, he finally received news about a member of his family, his younger brother, Mubashir, who, as far as he knew, was still living in their homeland, Ifriqiya. Now, Abraham ben Yiju was from the Jewish community of Tunisia, of what is now Tunisia. But he actually moved from Tunisia to Cairo, and it was from Cairo that he traveled to India. Such news as Ben Yiju received from the Middle East could only have given him further cause for anxiety. From 1143 onwards, for several successive years, his homeland, Ifriqiya, had been the target of attacks launched by King Roger II of Sicily. Disease and famine had followed upon these raids, and large numbers of people fled the region. Along with a substantial section of the Jewish population of Ifriqiya, the Ben Yiju family was swept away from Mahdia, which is also in Tunisia, at about this time, and they were deposited in Sicily, unbeknownst to their brother Abraham, who was living in quiet and untroubled prosperity in distant Mangalore. So you see this family. I mean, it's just completely dispersed. One brother is in Mangalore, one brother is in Sicily. Far away though he was, Ben Yiju was probably not unaware of the bloodshed and turmoil that had stricken his homeland. It so happens that the Geniza had yielded a letter addressed to Ben Yiju's friend, the indefatigable traveler, Abu Zikri Ha-Kohan Sijil Masi, which contains a detailed account of the events in North Africa. The letter was written by Abu Zikri's son in Cairo and sent to him in Aden in 1148. Not long before, in 1145, Abu Zikri Sijil Masi had been stranded in Gujarat after being captured by pirates. On that occasion, Ben Yiju had penned a letter to him on behalf of his brother-in-law, Mehruz from Mangalore. Now, 3 years later, upon learning of the events in North Africa, Abu Zikri would certainly have made an effort to pass the news on to Ben Yiju in Mangalore. It may have been this piece of news, following hard upon other events, that finally made up Ben Yiju's mind. He had probably already written to Madmoon, his friend, to sort out whatever tangle it was that had kept him so long absent from Aden. From his friends' letters, it would seem that he had written to others as well, mentioning thoughts of return. Every year you speak of coming to Aden, wrote Khalaf in his letter of 1148, but you never do it. This time, Benyeju did do it. A year later, in 1149, he left and was back in Aden with all his worldly goods and his 2 adolescent children. His children were with an Indian woman, probably not Jewish, but a Malabari woman. On 11 September 1149, Benyeju wrote his brothers a long letter from Aden. His return had stirred many long-settled memories, and he was now overcome with a desire to reclaim his family and the remembered landscapes of his childhood. I do not know what to write, the letter begins. So strong is my longing and so ardent my yearning. The thought uppermost in Benyeju's mind at the time of writing was of providing reassurance and succor to his family. He had heard, he wrote, that their circumstances were now so dire that they had been reduced to a single loaf of bread, and he had tried to send them some goods to tide them over the worst. But the shipment had gone astray because of the uncertainty of their present location.
Perhaps you should take it out.
Where is it?
It's the kind of thing that always happens to me, so...
It's the sound effect. Tinkling of bells.
He was writing now to offer them whatever else he could, to let them know that he had returned from India and arrived safely in Aden, with my belongings, life and children well preserved, and money enough to live on for all of us. Therefore, I ask you, my brothers, he urged, come to me under any circumstances and without delay. I have a son and a daughter. Take them and take them with all the money and riches. May God fulfill my wishes and yours for the good. Come quickly and take possession of this money. This is better than strangers taking it. But he had another reason too for urging his brothers to join him in Aden under any circumstances and without delay. With his departure from India, his yearning for his family had grown so powerful that he now longed to reaffirm his bonds with them through a familial union of some kind. Also find out, he directed them, who is the best of the sons of my brother Yusuf or the sons of your sister Berakha, so that I may marry him off to my daughter. So Benyeju did eventually come back. He did eventually travel back to Cairo. All his letters ended up in the Geniza, which is why I was able to read them years and years later in Cambridge. But one of the strange things that happened to me also while I was living in this village in Egypt, this village was near a town called Damanhur. And all the time that I lived in this village, people would talk to me about a saint, a sheikh who was from Damanhur. And the name of this saint was Sheikh Abu Hasira. And I always had the impression that he was a Sufi saint, a Muslim Sufi saint, because that's how it was presented to me. And in fact, it's one of those strange things, so reminiscent of a certain kind of Middle Eastern life and also of Indian life. You know, we have peers in where I'm from, in Bengal, who are, in a way, neither Hindu nor Muslim, and who are venerated by both, you know. And that had, I think, historically been the case over here. But one day I decided that I returned to Egypt in about 1990, and I decided I would actually go to visit the tomb of Sheikh Abu Hasira. And he was very close to to the village that I'd lived in. So I got this young guy, a driver, and we set off. Mohsin was from a hamlet near Nashawi, which is where I live, a corpulent youth in his mid-20s or so. He had a little bristling mustache, and he always wore freshly laundered white jalabiyas, great dazzling garments that billowed around him like parachutes. Mohsin was a good talker, full of self-confidence and amazingly knowledgeable about such things as the exchange rates of various kinds of dinars and the prices of Nikons and Seikos. He had acquired this stock of information while living in the Gulf, where he had spent a couple of years working in construction. He hadn't hadn't cared much for his work, however. Climbing scaffolding didn't suit him. Eventually, he had succeeded in persuading two of his brothers, who had jobs in Iraq, to join him in investing in a second-hand van. And for the last several months, he had been ferrying passengers back and forth between the towns and villages of the district. We stopped to ask directions on the borders of Damanhur, and then turned onto a narrow road that skirted around a crowded working-class area. Nutshells and scraps of colored papers lay scattered everywhere now, and it was easy to tell that the road had recently been teeming with festive crowds. Mohsen had never been to this part of the city before, but he was confident that we were heading in the right direction. When next we stopped to ask for the tomb of Sidi Abu Hasira, we were suddenly immediately pointed to a large structure half hidden behind a row of date palms a little further down the road. I was taken by surprise at my first glimpse of the building. It looked nothing like the saints' tombs I had seen before. It was a sleek concrete structure of a kind that one might expect to see in the newer and more expensive parts of Alexandria and Cairo. In that poor quarter of Damanhur, it was not merely incongruous, its presence seemed almost an act of defiance. A long, narrow driveway led from the entrance of the compound to a covered porch adjoining the tomb. The ground seemed deserted when we turned in at the gate, and it was not till we were halfway down the drive that we noticed a handful of men lounging round a desk in the shade of the porch. One of them was dressed in a blue jalabeya. The rest were armed and in uniform. At the sight of those uniforms, Mohsen suddenly became tense and apprehensive. Like me, he had expected to see a domed tomb with some candles burning outside, perhaps, and a few people gathered around a grave. The uniforms instantly aroused that deep mistrust of officialdom that had been bred into him by generations of Fellah forefathers. I could tell that his every instinct was crying out to him to turn the van around and speed away. But it was already too late. The men were on their feet now, watching us, and some of them were fingering their guns. The van was surrounded the moment we drew up under the porch. Reaching in through my window, a hand undid the lock and jerked the door open. I stepped out to find myself face to face with a ruddy, pink-cheeked man dressed in a blue jalabeya. He was holding the door open for me, and with a deep bow and a smile, he gestured towards a police officer seated at the desk under the porch. The officer was a young man, probably a recent graduate from training school. He watched with a puzzled and slightly annoyed expression as I walked over to his desk. "What are you doing here?" he snapped at me, in the kind of tone he might have used towards a slow-witted subordinate. "I came to look at the tomb," I said. "I heard there was a Maulid here recently." On hearing me speak, he realized I was a foreigner, and there was an instant change in his tone and manner. He looked me over, smiling, and a gleam of recognition came into his eyes. "Israeli?" he said. When I told him I was Indian, his smile vanished and was quickly replaced by a look of utter astonishment. Confirming what I had said with a glance at my passport, he turned to me in blank incomprehension. What was my business there, he wanted to know. What was I doing at that tomb? My Arabic was becoming tangled now, but as best I could, I explained to him that I had heard about the Maulid of Sidi Abu Hasira and had decided to pay the tomb a visit on my way to the station. From his deepening frown, I knew that my answer had not been satisfactory. "The Maulid was over," he said. "The tourists were gone and the tomb was deserted. The time for sightseeing was well past now." Opening my passport, he thumbed through it again, from back to front, coming to a stop at the page with my photograph. "Are you Jewish?" he said. "No." "Muslim?" "No." "Christian?" When I said no yet again, he gave a snort of annoyance and slammed my passport on the desk. Turning to the others, he threw up his hands. Could they understand it, he asked? Neither Jewish, nor Muslim, nor Christian. There had to be something very odd afoot. I started to explain once more, but he had lost interest in me now. Rising to his feet, he turned towards Mohsen, who was waiting near the van. The man in the blue jalabeya was standing beside him, and when the officer beckoned, he pushed Mohsen forward. Poor Mohsen was terrified now, and he would not look at me. His habitual confidence and good humor had ebbed away. He was cringing, his vast, rotund form shaking with fear. Before the officer could speak, he began to blurt out an explanation. "It's nothing to do with me, Your Excellency," he cried, his voice rising in panic. "I don't know who the foreigner is, and I don't know what he's doing here. He was staying in a village next to ours, and he wanted to visit this tomb on the way to the station. I don't know anything more. I have nothing to do with him." The officer spun around to look at me. "What were you doing in a village?" he snapped. "What took you there? How long have you been traveling around the countryside without informing the proper authorities?" I started to explain how I had first arrived in Lataifa as a student years ago, but the officer was in no mood to listen. His mind could now barely keep pace with his racing suspicions. Without a pause, he rattled off a series of questions, one after another. Who had I been meeting in the villages, he asked. Were they from any particular organization? What had I talked about? Were there any other foreigners working with me? My protests and explanations were brushed aside with an impatient gesture. The officer was now far too excited to listen. I would soon have an opportunity to explain to someone senior, he told me. This was too serious a matter for someone in his position to deal with. Seating himself at his desk, he quickly wrote out a note and handed it to the ruddy-faced man in a jalabeya, along with my passport and Mohsin's papers. "Go with him," he told me. "He will take you where you have to go." Mohsin and I found ourselves back on the van within moments, and with the man in the jalabeya sitting between us. He was holding Mohsin's papers and my passport firmly in his hands. "Everything will soon be clear, sir," he said. When I asked him where he was taking us, he was heavily built with a mustache that was almost blonde and a clear-cut angular profile that hinted at Macedonian or Albanian forebears somewhere in his ancestry. He raised our papers reverentially to his forehead and bowed. "I am under your orders and at your command, Tahta Amrak wa Iznak." I noticed then that his speech, except for its elaborate unctuousness, was exactly that of a fellah, with only the faintest trace of a city accent. Dressed as he was in his fellah's cap and jalabeya, he would have been perfectly at home in the lanes of Nashawi and Lataifa, where I had lived. Mohsin interrupted him with a sudden show of anger, demanding to know what crime he had committed. He had regained his composure a little now that he was back in his van. In reply, the man began to thumb through Mohsin's license and registration papers. Then, in a voice that was silky with feigned deference, he pointed out that the permit did not allow him to carry passengers. Instantly, Mohsin's shoulders sagged and his self-possession evaporated. The man had taken his measure with practiced accuracy. The papers had probably taken Mohsin months to acquire, maybe cost him a substantial sum of money, as well as innumerable hours spent standing at the desks of various government officials. When Mohsin next spoke, his voice was hoarse and charged with an almost hysterical urgency. "You sound as though you're from the countryside around here, sir," he said. "Is your village in this area?" The man in the jalabeya nodded, smiling affably, and named a village not far from Damanhur. The name seemed to electrify Mohsin. "Alhamdulillah," he cried. "God be praised, I know that village well, I know it well. Why, I've been there many times, many times." For the rest of the drive, in a desperate effort to invoke the protective bonds of neighborhood and kinship, to tame the abstract, impersonal terror the situation had inspired in him, Mohsin mined every last vein of his memory for a name that would be familiar to his captor. The man humored him, smiling, and deflected his questions with answers that were polite but offhand. Skilled in his craft, he knew perfectly well that there was no more effective way of striking terror into a village boy like Mohsin than by using his own dialect to decline his accustomed terms of communication, those immemorial courtesies of village life by which people strove to discover mutual acquaintances and connections. By the time we reached our destination, a high-walled, heavily guarded building on a busy road, Mohsin was completely unnerved, drenched in sweat. He protested feebly as we were herded in past an armed sentry, but no one paid him any attention. He was marched quickly off towards a distant wing of the building, while I, in turn, was led to a room at the end of a corridor and told to go in and wait. Well, then an interrogator came in. Taking off his sunglasses, he seated himself behind the desk. He had a lean gunmetal face with curly hair that was grizzled at the temples. He placed my passport and the note from the officer in front of him, and after he had looked through them, he sat back in his chair with his eyes hard and unsmiling. "What is the meaning of this?" he said. I knew I had to choose my words with care, so speaking slowly, I told him I had heard many people talking about the Mawlid of Sidi Abu Hasira over the last several days. They had said that many tourists came to Damanhur to visit the Mawlid, so I had decided to do some sightseeing too, before catching the train to Cairo later in the day. He listened with close attention, and when I had finished, he said, "How did you learn Arabic? And what were you doing traveling in the countryside?" "I'd been here years ago," I said, and I explained how I'd come to Egypt as a doctoral student and been brought to that district by an eminent anthropologist. My interrogator examined the document, and then, giving it back to me, he said, "But this does not explain what you were doing at the tomb. What took you there?" "I was just interested," I said, "that's all." "But you're not Jewish or Israeli," he said. "You're Indian. What connection could you have with the tomb of a Jewish holy man here in Egypt?" He was not trying to intimidate me. I could tell he was genuinely puzzled. He seemed so reasonable and intelligent that for an instant I even thought of telling him the story of Bomna and Abraham ben Yiju. Well, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad that you chose it in Antique Land. And that was, in fact, the first of your novels I read. You are all welcome to we're going to have a break now for coffee, and we will reconvene for a discussion with our authors and also with Meir Shalev at... let's see, at past. Yes, we need a half an hour. Yes, around 1:25.
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon.
There you go.
And welcome to the second part of our symposium today. I would like to once again, first thing I want to ask you is if everyone can just double check with regard to their cell phones. Just take a half minute now, check so that we know we won't be interrupted. People are still coming in. Okay. Okay. I'd like to once again thank the Dan David family for making the symposium possible and for enabling us to bring these wonderful writers. And I also want to thank the Dan David office for helping us with the arrangements for this event. And to our wonderful department secretary in the English department, Ilana Edgar, for all of her hard work in this regard. Okay. Now, we had originally invited 3 Israeli authors. Unfortunately, Yoshua Sobol had to go abroad. One of his plays is being performed in Vienna and rehearsals, and he had to, fortunately, of course. Fortunately, it's being performed. Unfortunately, he couldn't be in both places at the same time. And this morning, Michal Govrin had to deal with an emergency, and she canceled. But we are very, very, very happy to have Meir Shalev with us. And since I have already introduced, or the other writers from abroad have been introduced, let me just say a few words about our Israeli author before I will begin with a series of questions to the authors. So first let me say that Meir Shalev is one of Israel's leading authors. He was born in Nahalal, Israel's first moshav, moved to Jerusalem, and continues to split his time between country and city. And he has written novels and essays, is a regular columnist in the Israeli press. His work has been published in over 20 languages. His novels are imbued with nature, with scents, colors, and tastes. And at the same time, they are also imbued with the Bible as a rich mine of human behavior for modern secular man, and as poetry for the everyday. In Shalev's books, humor, social satire, and history coexist with the magical and the fabulous. Among his many published works are The Blue Mountain, Roman Russi, Esav, 4 Meals, Kiyamim Achadim, A Pigeon and a Boy, Yona Venal. His most recent book, Hadavar Haya Kacha, will be published in English with a fascinating English translation of that, My Russian Grandmother and Her Vacuum Cleaner. Meir Shalev has also written many delightful children's books, and of course I won't mention them all, but I have to mention my children's favorite and our favorite, the classic, ever classic, Abba Oseh Bushot. My father always embarrasses me. And that's, of course, translatable across cultures. Yes. Okay, so let me begin by saying that the topic for the prizes this year in literature was renditions of the 20th century. And Meir Shalev's narrator in his novel, A Pigeon and a Boy, makes the following observation. I'm quoting now from his book. I thought mostly about myself and my story, and the need for a story in general, and what a man whose story reached its climax before he was born is supposed to do with himself. Now, those of you who've read the novel know that there's a very specific, dramatic story that preceded that character's life. But this can also be a commentary about being born in a generation in the aftermath of colossal events, cataclysmic events that preceded your arrival. All of you are writers of a generation whose parents' generation lived through very tumultuous events, and you've all chosen to write about them. The Holocaust, the Second World War, both in Europe and in Asia, the end of empire in Palestine and India, the partition of Pakistan and India, and the bloodshed that ensued, the War of Independence here, and the long tentacles of fascism as they affect Canada as well. To quote from The Blind Assassin from Margaret Atwood's novel, "A war is a huge fire. The ashes from it drift far and settle slowly." So I'd like to ask you, what can you tell us about the decision to write about the events that preceded your own arrival? And what are the particular challenges of writing about that period? Who would like to begin?
already talked about that.
Perhaps Meir Shalev, since he's joined us.
Thank you. I want to apologize first for my English, especially in the presence of such distinguished writers in this language, but let me assure you my Hebrew is okay. And this is the language I use when I write my stories. It is true that I write about the generation even more than my parents, but the generation of my grandparents, whom I knew many members of this generation in the village where I was born. These were the pioneers of the second Aliyah, legendary era in the history of Zionism and Israel. And I remember them not only as ideologists and political figures and social prophets in a way, but also as very special people in their private lives and their personality, even about things that have to do with their, I would say, their family life and love life. For example, all my grandparents, the two grandfathers and the two grandmothers, were more passionate, more daring, more, I would say, interesting in this aspect of their lives than my modern permissive generation. Even though it all happened 100 years ago, the story of my grandmother on my father's side is very dramatic. She was a member of one of the first settlements in the valley of Jezreel, Merchavia. Her husband left Palestine then, Eretz Israel, because he was afraid to be taken to the Turkish army to the First World War. When he came back 3 years later, he found his wife, my grandmother, pregnant from another man. This was my father, by the way, the result. So you see, we have great stories in the family, even without taking into account the national ideological Zionistic revolutionary stories, and we have more stories like this if we are many members in the family, and I think sometimes I have a feeling they set one eye when I was a little child, and they saw me looking at them when they were telling the stories, and decided that they will supply me with more and more of that stuff. But I remember these people as very special, almost biblical in their behavior. They were also, I would say, aware of their being special people. When I started to write my first novel, The Blue Mountain, Roman Rossi, where they were the heroes of this novel, I went to interview, I think, the 20 last people of the second Aliyah. All of them were more than 90 years old, and all of them were, I wouldn't say happy, but they were ready to talk to me and tell me from this distance about their youth. And I could see that even though ideology was a very strong aspect of their lives, and I would say this was the light tower in which light they moved from East Europe to here, still their personal feelings, the personal characters, the stubbornness, the strength, the passions, the emotions, these were the most interesting aspects for me as a writer, and also their very special humor, who rose again after years of ideological show-off, to all the people, the younger generation around them. I remember one of them who was 96 years old when I met him. He said, "I've heard about you. You go, you interview all us, the old people of the second Aliyah, and you ask them questions. Why are you talking to these people? They have no idea what they are talking about." I said, "But you are the oldest of them. All of them are more than 90, but still, you're 96, you're the oldest of them." He said, "You don't get me correctly. They were stupid as young people as well." And this kind of humor, whom I never encounter as a young boy from the same people. They allowed it to themselves only as older people. This was something very different, very refreshing, and I must tell you that some people interpret my writing about them as some kind of how would you say, zilzul, looking at them.
Belittling.
Pardon?
Belittling them.
Okay. Belittling. It's a new word for me. From little.
Yes.
Good. Belittling them. It's nice. But it's not. It was with while writing, I felt the love and appreciation and even admiration to these people, not only to my grandparents but to their colleagues as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Margaret, would you like to, or whoever wants to go next?
Well, I'm from the generation that's was born immediately after the partition of India. And by some strange coincidence, I also ended up spending a part of my early childhood in Bangladesh, which was the side of the border from which my family came. And, these issues, the issue that partition created for us, this huge migrations out of Bangladesh, out of Burma. A lot of my family made this great march over the mountains from Burma into India in 1941, 1942, when the Japanese invaded Burma. These have been enormously powerful influences upon my work, enormously powerful ideas to deal with. Especially, for example, the Great March out of Burma, which was an astonishing event. Hundreds of thousands of people, young people, old people, entire families, trekking over these enormous mountains. Literally being eaten by predatory animals, by being bitten by snakes. Dying in the weather, dying of hunger. Just to excavate that history, it was something very important and at the same time really traumatizing, if you like. For me, it was also a kind of strange thing because I'm a novelist I'm a writer who by inclination likes technical challenges. I came of age as a writer in that period, when we were all very interested in Borges and so on, and in playing with techniques and structures. But when I started writing, especially when I started writing The Glass Palace, I realized that in some way the story itself is so powerful, and it's also a story that's unknown, and that I couldn't do any of that, because the story, to be persuasive, had to be told as a story. And I realize now that one of the things that in relation to, say, European novelists or American novelists, because they deal with histories that are so much known, so intricately worked out, that they're following after, their story is layered upon layer after layer of those stories. For example, today, so many younger writers are still writing about the Holocaust, but in fact, so much has already been written before that they have to find some really intricately new angle to enter it, for me, as it were, it was just the telling of the story was overwhelming, because so many of these stories have never been touched or told, or are just completely unknown.
Thank you. Welcome. Deep background. You should never ask me to vote for you, because you will lose. My ancestral background is a whole series of people who are on the losing side of something or other. So, first of all, the Puritans who went to New England left, you are told in standard history, because they went in search of religious freedom. That's not exactly true. They went in search of religious freedom for themselves, but not for anybody else. And they put that into practice as soon as they got there. It was Nathaniel Hawthorne who said the first edifices they put up were a prison and a gallows. So these were not kindly, happy, friendly. In fact, it was an offense to point. Pointing and smiling were offenses under this theocracy. And that is why, in fact, I dedicated The Handmaid's Tale to Perry Miller, who brought 17th century Puritan studies to Harvard, because these non-pointing, non-smiling people were, in fact, my ancestors. And if you've ever heard of the Webster's Dictionary by Noah Webster, that's one of the guys. So along comes the American Revolution. We were on the wrong side. So we went to, that branch of the family went to Canada and intermarried with some French Huguenots who were also on the wrong side. Left France because during the 18th century, France was called the desert by the Protestants. It was such an unhospitable place for them. They were severely persecuted. Not that they wouldn't have done the same had they had the chance. And they were joined by some Scottish people who had been kicked out of Scotland for being on the wrong side. They too went to Nova Scotia and were joined by some Welsh people who had to leave Wales as economic refugees. So after that, all of these people were in Nova Scotia, and after that my parents had to leave Nova Scotia because it was the Depression and Nova Scotia was very poor.
Okay, that was persuasive. Right.
Then I went to, I'm not finished. I spent what the French call my petite enfance in northern Quebec, where I was also a member of an out group because I wasn't francophone. But that was all right because I lived in the woods and there weren't any other people. But there were bears, and I was not a bear either. Skip to high school.
I'll tell you two stories about my high school youth. 1956, I was a delegate to the Model United Nations. We had Model United Nations, and out of a hat, we were chosen to represent Egypt. So these kids in a Toronto suburb, they weren't all Scots and English. Some of them were Armenians, which is a whole other story. So I knew all about the Armenians pretty early on. If you're Canadian, you'll know that a certain generation always said to their children, eat everything on your plate because of the starving Armenians. But why? I mean, why will that help them? But never mind. So we represented Egypt, and it fell to our lot to make an impassioned plea on behalf of the Palestinians, which we did. We said everything that you might imagine. Why is this fair? Why is this happening? Why aren't you compensating? Why aren't you letting people have their homes back? Everything you could think of, we made the speech. And the reply from the other side was, don't you want there to be a state of Israel? Is that not still the argument, in essence? 2 years later, I was hired to teach, you will find this very amusing, I was hired to teach at a Reform Jewish coeducational children's summer camp. I was to introduce the nature program. My little boys, who were 7, said to me when I arrived, "Are you Jewish?" I said, "No." "Are you Christian?" "No." Then they said, "Are you the cleaning lady?" So those were the 3 categories. That's what I think of myself. I'm the cleaning lady. I'm the one who looks in your drawers when you're not there. So I'm that person, and I did that for 3 years. It was very interesting. And in that period, which is the late 50s, it was very, very idealistic at such places. We were very big on the brotherhood of man. We sang very inclusive global brotherhood of man songs. I will sing some of them for you if you wish. I can also do a very good rendition of a couple of Israeli folk dances, if you would like to see me do that. I was constantly being told that I was a very nice girl and they would marry me if only I was Jewish. But I wasn't. So that was, and the kinds of programs we would do is we would, there were these things called camp wides in which we put on these events, and you always woke the kids up in the middle of the night and put on some event for them. And one of them was a couple of bonfires in which Phil and Nate put on asbestos suits and stood in the middle of the bonfire with microphones and said they were from outer space. They were from, and they had come down to tell us that unless we did world peace in the next 3 days, they were going to destroy the earth. Whereupon all the little kids started crying, and then the big kids said, "It's only Phil and Nate." But that's what we were interested in. We were interested in brotherhood of man and world peace. Have those topics ceased to be of interest?
Thank you. Obviously, no. Thank you. Okay. I'd like to turn to the topic of home. In Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Shadow Lines, in the chapter entitled Coming Home, the narrator recalls that as a boy he teased his schoolmistress grandmother because he caught her making a grammar mistake. When she called her imagined return to Dhaka from Calcutta as a coming home. At that time, Dhaka was the capital of East Pakistan, now the capital of Bangladesh. And so the child, right, says to his grandmother, "How could you have come home to Dhaka? You don't know the difference between coming and going." And the narrator concludes later in the novel, in our family, we don't know whether we're coming or going. Now, all three of you have written about the very shifting and fluid boundaries of home. And maybe the only characters who always know exactly where home is are Meir Shalet's homing pigeons, right? But the humans in your works are very affected by shifting boundaries. The books are full of passports, identity cards, changing languages, ethnicity. So I'd like to sort of ask each of you about concept of home, exile, home, not home, and home identities in your works. Perhaps also, if you want to relate to this, nation as one of the categories of home, or not nation. Who would like to begin with this? Mayor, all right.
Well, first, I think this is not fair to our guests because, exile is our business. And we are the true experts. We are the best in this topic. It's like asking me to play basketball in America. It's. So I will not talk about the exile, Hagolah, even though many Israeli and Jewish people abroad interpreted A Pigeon and the Boy as a book about the Jewish people coming back home like the pigeons back to their loft, as is the metaphor in the Bible. And this is true that I used the homing pigeon first as a metaphor, and by the way, I was assisted by two books, one from India and one from Canada, and I thought about it on the way here. One called Gay Neck, The Story of a Pigeon by Dehan Gopal Mukherjee, a Bengali writer who published it in the USA in 1927. It's about a homing pigeon that worked for the Indian troops in the First World War in the Netherlands. And the other one is of the Canadian naturalist Ernst Thompson Seton. I have all his books in my home. Good. All his books in Hebrew and in English.
That's so sad.
And I like his writing since early age. When I read him in Hebrew, Chayot habar binot megureihen and Chayot habar asher yada'ati. Wild animals I have known, and he was a great writer, and nobody knows about him in North America today. Good, but you're a naturalist, and he has a nice story about a homing pigeon, about Arnaud, who is a homing pigeon working for a paper, flying in Quebec from a journalist to the editorial offices with news. Anyway, home. So, I can tell you something about the home of my grandmother, which I describe in my last book, which for us children was the place nobody is allowed to go into. This was we were always left out because my grandmother was very fanatic about the cleaning of her house. And she didn't let anybody in, and she had on each of the handles of a door, a window, a cupboard, a drawer, there was always a little rug, so you will not touch the metal with your hands. The shower was in the cowshed, because, if somebody goes into the shower, that means he's a dirty person. Otherwise, he has nothing to do there. So he shouldn't be allowed into the house as well. So this was grandmother's house, or grandmother's home was the place where nobody is allowed to go into. And only later I understood that she wasn't really crazy about cleanliness, but this was her way of creating her own territory. In the atlas you have the different countries painted in each country in its own color. In our village, the house of my grandmother was painted by cleanliness. This was the definition of the territory. And this was her protest against, I would say, the ideology of the village, the pioneers, the rules, the laws, the eyes that were always checking and evaluating, are you going according to our standards, our ideals, our laws? And this is something that I understood only many years later. Now, loving home and feeling homesick is very natural to not only to people but also to many kinds of animals, and maybe they do not color it with the same language and expressions we do, but I do believe in this very basic attraction to a certain place. And I remember we lived in Jerusalem in a small housing project in Jerusalem, a very modest, unattractive place I never really liked. But I remember that every time we used to come back home, whether it was from the grocery or from another town, my mother would open the house with the key, the door, and say in Hebrew, Shav Hatzayad, Shav Min Hahar, no, Shav Hasapan, Shav Min Hayam, Chazar Hatzayad Min Hahar, which is a verse you know, home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter back from the hills. She was quoting Robert Louis Stevenson every time she went back home, so excited about it, and then she would say, Tagid labayit shalom, say hello to the house, and it will answer you. And it did, you know, and it still does. And this is something that I appreciate, again, not necessarily on the national level, but more on the personal level, the connection between one and his place.
Nice, thank you.
I think you imprint on places as a child, like ducks, you know, and then that's your place. I moved quite a lot, so that didn't happen to me in a really uniform way, but instead I'm going to talk about the national scale. I grew up as a child in something that was still the British Empire. The map was very pink. We had the king and queen looking down on us from the schoolroom. She's still on the stamps, by the way. It's still, the Queen of England is still the Queen of Canada, mostly because the idea of opening up the Constitution and trying to redo it is just too horrific. I mean, it would just be such a nightmare. So we are a constitutional monarchy of a very odd kind. But it was really British at school when I was a child up until about the age of 10 or 12, and then it became, but at the same time it was very American after school, because we were the comic book generation. So we were reading all of these comic books which came from the United States. You could send away 4 things advertised at the back of the comic book, but it always said, offer good only in the United States. So we could never actually get those things. So we were and we weren't. We were culturally getting more and more American, but educationally we were still quite British. We read a lot of British 19th century literature, partly because there wasn't any sex in it, at least not right there on the page. It was off stage, leading to many questions that they did not answer in school. So I really didn't think a lot about Canada at that time. And I did not think about it until I went to the United States as a graduate student. And there I had to study to fill in something called my gap. I had to study 17th century American literature and civilization, something we had not touched on or even thought about in my undergraduate courses. It was actually quite interesting. There was a lot of letters and diaries and journals and sermons. And one of the thoughts it gave me was, okay, if this is what we're studying at Harvard, why can't we study Canadian literature in Canada, which we were not doing. It wasn't a defined subject. It wasn't really acknowledged. It wasn't, in some way, it didn't exist. I then worked for a market research company, and we did a lot of questionnaires, and one of them was, do you think that Canada is different from the United States? Most people said no. And then they said, do you think that Canada should join with the United States? And most people said no. And what this meant to me was they knew it was somehow different, but they had not articulated that difference. And that's when I seriously started to think about what the differences were. And my work of the early 1970s in that area came out of the fact that Canadians were simply not taught about their literature at all. They weren't even taught that they had one. They did have one. It was deeply buried, out of print, or in a special section of the bookstore called Canadiana, where you would get the beautiful fall leaf calendar with red leaves, you would get the cookbook, and you would get the 1 or 2 novels that had been published that year, because there were not many at all at that time. So that's what I was thinking about then. Do nations matter if you're a writer? I always go back to the beginning of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where young Stephen is writing in the front of his book, and he puts his name, he puts his address, he puts his street, he puts his city, he puts his township, he puts his country, he puts the continent of Europe, he puts the planet Earth, and then he puts the universe. And that's where we all live. We all live in all of those places. So the nation is one of those categories, but it's by no means the only one, and nobody can be defined just by that.
Thank you. Amitav.
Well, you know, I've lived in many different places, but I grew up as a child. My father had one of those jobs. He was posted various places in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Iran, and so on. So we were always moving, and I was for a long time I was in boarding school in northern India, and you know, then I've lived in India, taught in India. And for many years, I've also lived part-time, at least in America, while also living in India. And I think at the end of all this, one thing which has become completely apparent to me over the years, and ever more so over the years, is that I'm completely Indian. I could never be American. I like New York, I think it's wonderful, but I'm just not American. I could never be American. I could not share, you know, in the projects that are essential to Americans. I don't have that history, I don't have that culture, and it would be a betrayal of myself, you know, to try and become something that I am not. So, you know, coming as I do from a group of people who have actually had to leave their ancestral lands and so on, and what can I say? I feel very grateful for India. You know, I just feel grateful that it exists. I feel grateful that it's there for me, that I can be there, that, you know, I have a place there, that people read my books there. At a certain point in my life, I used to feel that nations were inessential, and that borders were completely artificial and so on. I think one thing I have come to see from my experience as a South Asian, as someone who's come, you know, out of a South Asian experience, is that the nation, after all, is an institution. And institutions have a certain reality. And it's not easy to build those institutions. It's not easy to create those institutions. It's a very long, hard, difficult project. But it's an important project because I've been in places where nations actually don't exist. The borderland of Burma. There's this huge borderland of Burma, and I had a very strange experience there. I was traveling with these insurgents, who are fighting the Burmese government, and we were in the forests, living in these little huts, and there were young guys with guns. So we were living in these huts, and they were very nice. They were really nice guys, and they would try to make me comfortable. And we slept on these bamboo platforms. So they would give me occasionally books to use as pillows. And one night, I looked at the book that they had given me, and it was a book by the very great Israeli military historian, Martin von, I'm forgetting his name, I think it's Krevel, yes, The Transformation of War. And that book really, it's a profoundly important book because, the central idea that he has is that a war of the strong against the weak can never be won. And I think he has looked at the Israeli situation very, very closely in formulating this idea. But anyway, there I was on the Burmese border. I took out this book, started reading it. I read it through the night. And it struck me that, I'm living in a place where, in fact, the nation state has disappeared. And what has replaced it? It's not universal freedom and love or whatever, those things that we would like. It's actually warlords. The alternative to the nation is not something better. It's in fact something much worse. It's warlordism. It's the worst kinds of petty tyranny. So there's a lot of. India is a place. It's an embattled nation. It's a nation where there's a lot going wrong, and there is a lot that's gone wrong with India. But I do think at the end of the day, the nation creates a small space, or a large space, if you like, within which we can actually address rationally, issues, problems, and so on, which is not possible in the situation of warlordism. It just isn't. So in that sense, I do feel very much that nations are important. It's important what sort of nation you make. It's important to think about the direction of your nation. It's important to think about those things. It's important to be active, within the nation in those ways. So, and we can see this when we look at South Asia. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka were once upon a time, Burma, quite similar. Now they're completely not similar, at least in these political aspects. And that is, because our nation, fortunately, was built upon the heritage of Mahatma Gandhi. So much has gone wrong. I think Gandhi, if he came to India today, would be horrified. And yet, there is something there. There is something to be built. And at the end of the day, I feel we have to be grateful for it.
Thank you. One thing that definitely all three of you share is a great respect and love of nature. And your works are just full of fragrances and tastes and textures and animals. Mayor Shalev's and Margaret Atwood's birds, the many birds, and the dolphins and tigers in Amitav Ghosh's works. And in Margaret Atwood's works, the monstrous new species that really make us yearn for those species that are disappearing. And so I'd like you to talk about the place of nature in your works, in your creativity, and your thinking about yourselves. Mayor.
Well, first I want to say something that I want you to know that I got a literary prize no other writer in the world ever received, and this is the literary prize of the Israeli Entomological Society. It was the only time they gave such a prize. It was given for my first novel, and the words were, it is given to me for describing the humble world of insects in an accurate and loving manner.
Which
And
ones did you describe?
I described almost any grasshopper, beetle, or fly in the valley of Jezreel.
Ants?
Ants too.
Ants too.
But a little less. I don't like ants so much because they are highly disciplined. I like individuals like the praying mantis, for example, or the dung beetles, which are. But especially I like the גחלילית, איך את אומרת? Firefly, because the firefly for me is also an example of what happened to the nature in Israel, because when I was a kid there were hundreds of fireflies every night in the village, and today I don't see one of them. I saw one of them 3 years ago in the valley, and that's it. And it gives you an example about the hard time we give to these little creatures. Anyway, we come from traditionally from a bad attitude towards animals and nature. The first command God gave in the Hebrew Bible was be fruitful and multiply and rule over all the animals and insects and eat them and kill them and whatever. And it was repeated after the flood, when all the animals that Noah saved in his ark were again sentenced to slavery and oppression by man. And I would say that life in the Middle East with all these animals, and we had bears and lions in this area at biblical times, maybe were more frightening than today. And when the pioneers I was talking about before came back to their homeland 2,000 years ago, they were completely ignorant and detached from the fauna and flora of the land of Israel. They were afraid from nature, but they wanted to become friends. And there was a special way of teaching the young students 80 or 70 years ago in this country, where in other countries the systematization of the fauna was, to insects and mammals and birds and vertebrae and carnivores and whatever ways of systematization. But in our books, it was written in one of our famous teachers, Yoshua Margolin, when you go out to the young student, when you go out to the field, when you see a mammal, a reptile, or a bird, ask it, are you a friend or a foe? Halanu atayim letzarenu. Which means, do you support Zionism or are you against Zionism? And because there were animals who, like the mice, the field mice, were eating the wheat, so the mice was judged as anti-Zionist and animal. But the black snake was a great friend of Zionism. It was eating the mice. The most horrible enemy was the Anopheles mosquito. The Anopheles mosquito infected our pioneers with malaria. When I was 10 years old or 8 years old, they taught me in school how to tell the difference between the larva of the Anopheles mosquito and the Culex mosquito, so I could warn the authorities the minute I see one of the Anopheles devils coming back. And we were taught about these mosquitoes not in zoology classes, but in history and the story of and Zionism lessons. By the way, at the same time, the Anopheles mosquito killed, I would say, a few hundreds pioneers in the land of Israel. 20,000 Panamese workers died from malaria in Panama, digging the Panama Canal. But the Panamese government never made this mosquito a culture hero. You know, they never treated it the way we did. It is only these days that we start to understand the value and the value for us as well, not only to the animals and birds, of their existence, and we become more and more aware of their value. And when I write my books, I do not describe these creatures because I want to support them or to promote their expectancy of life, but because in a way I'm attached to them emotionally, and so I write about them the same way I write about other emotions I have.
It was interesting to hear what Mayor said about the sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of the relationship with nature, because I come from a completely different relationship with nature, where, there are all animals have some meaning, and all animals are to some degree anthropomorphized. And, when I was in Egypt, the only thing that the people around me knew was that Indians worship cows. So often when I was walking in the village and there was a cow, they would expect me to fall down. And I would tell them, no, if you go to India, once I remember walking in this village and we were walking, they saw someone beating a cow. And they went running up to this guy and stopped him and berated him. He'll feel bad if he sees you beating a cow, and all this stuff. So, look, in some way, I'm not a good Hindu at all, and I've been eating cows on and off for a long time now. But one thing I must say about the whole thing about not eating cows and so on is that, I do think it's important, if you look at it, if no animal is sacred, can nature itself be sacred? So I think in some way that is, the way of thinking that, in this one creature is represented, as it were, a certain attitude towards nature as a whole. The creature becomes a metaphor for the entirety of nature, And I do think that this is a good, it is good to be able to think of yourself as a part of nature. But the way in which in contemporary India the issues of nature arise for us are, to my mind, completely different from the ways in which they arise to a Westerner. I'll just give you a couple of reasons. One is that, what is happening today in India is that under the name of conservation, a very great number of people are actually being dispossessed of their lands. If you go to Indian forest reserves, you will see in some of these forest reserves entire depopulated villages, like, essentially like Arab villages in some parts of Israel. You see them absolutely depopulated. People have been moved out without compensation. These whole areas have been shut off to become forest reserves. What has happened is essentially the same thing as happened in Kenya, with the Ngorongoro crater, where the Maasai who've lived there for centuries and centuries, and who've lived with the animals, are actually suddenly shoved out, and you have a transfer of populations. Essentially what it is a kind of ethnic cleansing. You have a transfer of populations whereby tourists and the tourist industry moves in. So basically what it is that it's a huge land grab on the part of urban India to take away the lands of indigenous peoples, to take away the lands of ethnic groups. And the extraordinary sort of injustice of it is that these are the people who kept these animals alive. The idea that the animals had no relationship with human beings or that they lived in a pristine nature is completely wrong. We know that all forests are in some sense in an interaction with human beings. So when you take these people out, what happens? And they're forced off these lands. They become pauperized. They're not given any compensation. So what do? They become poachers. And we've seen this repeatedly, not just in India but also in Pakistan. In the Khunjarab Pass, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan set up this reserve to protect the Marco Polo sheep. At that point, there were just like 300 sheep left, and some German scientist came and told him this is the best way to do it. Just shove all the people off and protect the sheep. 20 years later, all the sheep were gone. Because you there create an enmity between man and nature which actually doesn't exist, which hasn't existed in our historical tradition. In India, under this thing called Project Tiger, billions and billions of dollars have been poured in by international organizations. Huge areas have been transferred, people have been pushed off, they've set up these nature conservancies and so on. Today, on most of those areas, the tiger is gone. The tigers has almost disappeared from those areas. The one area where tiger still flourishes is the Sundarbans in southern Bengal, where people still live. 4 million people live there in this mangrove forest, and that's where the tiger still lives and flourishes. So, I do think it raises nature and our relationship with nature raises a very important ethical question for us in India, which is different from the questions that it raises, say, in Canada or in North America. We cannot privilege, the protection of apex species at the expense of indigenous peoples and at the expense of other peoples. How do we work out this ethical dilemma of, preserving ecosystems under these conditions? It's very difficult, but the human being is an essential part of this ecosystem. You can't wish him away.
Okay. In BirdLife International, which is an organization that I work with, we do take the view that you have to work with the people because you cannot just shove the people out, and you cannot, and what you have to do is create a situation that is better for the people because those animals are there, rather than worse for the people because those animals are there. BirdLife is in fact a ground-up organization. It works with groups on the ground. It's an umbrella, an international umbrella organization, and that is in fact the only way that you can do it, partly because the people who live there are the ones who know it best anyway. They're the ones who know. So you have to work with them. We're talking about nature as biology, essentially, but we can move on to physics and chemistry. And in that sense, nature always has the final vote and does not negotiate. And that takes us right into the area of climate change, and Canada, having thought of itself for years as clean and green, is now having to wake up to the fact that it is dirty and has this huge tar sands project, which is adding a huge amount of greenhouse gases from a project that you would not believe how enormous it is. So on the one hand we have that, on the other hand we have a huge amount of boreal forest, which is one of the biggest carbon sinks, carbon capture things on the planet. So we can no longer pretend that we are these innocent, kindly, green canoeing people. We have to start taking responsibility for these things, and there is more and more attention being brought to that, but it's a big dilemma, of course, because there's huge money involved in this project, and when there's huge money, you're going to have a problem. There is a lot of thought going into alternative energy. I would say right here the problem is going to be increasing temperatures and dryness. So one of the coming problems, if it's not a problem already, is going to have to do with water. Is this not correct? How much water? Will there be enough water? How will the water, where will the water be used? Who will administer the water? How can more water be created? And if you'd like to look up on the internet a new technology called SaltWorks Tech. It's a cheap, scalable desalination process that runs on solar. Might be good.
Thank you. Thank you. All three of you are writers. Your medium is language. And so what I'd like to turn to now is language particular and local and language global. That is, you're all writers whose works are translated into many languages. And you're also writers who stretch the use of language in many ways. Margaret with all these neologisms, Sea of Poppies with this stretching of the language into 19th century, using these dictionaries from that period and so on. So I'd like to ask you about your readers, your knowing that the works will be translated, the way in which you use the local language, the way that Meir Shalev brings in the Hebrew, the biblical textuality, but you know full well, of course, it's going to be translated to all these other languages. Can you relate to what it means to be writing now for a global readership, but also, of course, for a particular readership? Who would like?
You have no control. The only feedback you get finally, you have to trust your publisher, you have to trust the translator, and then once in a while the readers, if you get to meet them, will tell you whether they thought the translation was any good or not. But if you don't speak any of these languages, it's not in your control. So you don't even, after a certain the further away a country is from you, the less control you have over the cover. You get some pretty surprising things on some of the covers of your books.
Yes.
I can go over only the translation to English. My English translator is here in the audience, and it's a chance to express my gratitude. And I hear from readers remarks, criticism, and praises for my translators to other languages. The one thing I do with my translators is that I ask them to read me aloud a page or two over the phone if they are in another country, because I want to listen if they kept the music of the text, if it has a music of a story, or it breaks your teeth when you reading aloud is a good test. I do it myself when I write. From time to time I read aloud to myself a passage to listen to how is it smooth, is it musical, does it have a rhythm, especially in different mouths in the book. One of my books that was translated to Japanese, you know, the children book you've mentioned, My Father Always Embarrasses Me. Japanese are very, I guess, orderly publishers. They sent me the pages to check from Tokyo to Israel. And I said, I don't like this line. I wrote, this line should be corrected on one of them. And then they sent me an article from Tokyo who proved to me that maybe the translation was good, because they said they wonder how come a Westerner could go so deep into the psychology of the Japanese family. And which shows you that even such different people as Japan and Israel do share the same family problems or behavior patterns, and even though there are a lot of differences, but still we are the same people in many respects. All different people are very similar to each other. Writing in Hebrew is something I want to say a few words about, because we write in an abnormal language. It's a language that was in a coma for 2,000 years, not dead, but in a coma. It was used only in synagogues and funerals and weddings. Or if a rabbi from Poland wanted to correspond with a rabbi from Yemen, this is the language they could communicate with. But still, it was in a coma in a way, which means it did not have words for a changing reality. When we decided, and I say this very proudly, it's an unmatched achievement of reviving a language like this. To revive the Hebrew language, we had to make up words for a toothbrush, for a tomato, for a car, for ice cream, for many things that did not exist in biblical or Talmudical eras, and we are still working on it. But still, it's abnormal in a way, because we can still read and understand a text that was written 3,000 years ago, together with our children. But then, when the same children are talking to their friends in the same language, we don't understand a word. So it's a very vivid, and changes that happened in other languages for along hundreds of years are happening here in a week. So sometimes it's very painful for somebody who appreciates the old layers of the language. I would just want to add one more thing, is that I got one of the editors who published a book I wrote about the Hebrew Bible, essays about the Old Testament, wanted to know which version of the translation of the Hebrew Bible to his language did my translator use, and which version of the Hebrew Bible did I use.
Great. Okay. Yes. Amitav, about language. Maybe you can share with us some of the things you discussed in class yesterday, or whatever, concerning the English language and Indian English and...
Well, I do actually try to work with some of the translators, who work in languages that I can sort of understand or have a handle on. But the translator who's perhaps closest to me is my translator into Bengali, and that I must say was very difficult for me, because it was strange. Some of my books. Some Indian writers have said to me that your books are basically Bengali books written in English. And it is often the case that, I'm literally translating out of one language in my head into another. And then to try and translate that back was so difficult that I found it kind of very difficult. But it's an engaging thing, to be working with your translators.
Mm-hmm. But you stretch the English language very much, I think, in terms of perhaps Western readers. And so what readership do you have in mind when you bring in a lot of terms and a lot of words that come out of Indian experience or Asian?
See, the curious thing is that if you look at the English language, I see with many of my colleagues writing in India in English, what they'll often do is that they'll italicize certain Indian words, like masjid meaning a mosque, or mandir meaning temple or whatever. Both these words have actually been in the Oxford English Dictionary for over a century. They've been in the English lexicon since the 17th and 18th centuries, So what is the consistent principle under which you begin to italicize? This is the question that arose for me. Because, in fact, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, it's hard to find a common Indian word that is not in it. So how do you address that?
English has the largest vocabulary of any language.
Yes, right. And
Because it steals.
I'm going to ask...
Steals everything.
It's very porous, right. I'm going to ask one last question, then you've kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. We have about, I guess, 15 minutes. I'd like to, at the Dundavi Prize ceremony, both Margaret Atwood and Amitav Ghosh made a statement about the novel genre, actually. And there's been so much talk, of course, over the years. Is the novel dead? Is the novel dead? Is it going to survive? And you wrote that, you said, the novel is a creature of nuance, of perhaps, of maybe. It concerns itself not with gods and demons, but with mortal people, with their flawed characters, their unsatisfactory bodies, their sufferings, their limited and often wrong choices, with the dubiousness of their own actions and the unfairness of their fates. And so I would like to ask each of you, since you write in also other genres, what is it about the novel? What's compelling about writing novels? Why novels today, now? Just thoughts about the genre.
All right, let's talk about narrative. Narrative is much older than writing. In fact, narrative, telling a story, telling somebody a story, probably is an evolved adaptation that we acquired in the Pleistocene, where we spent a great many generations, many more than we have spent being agriculturalists, and certainly many more than we have spent in the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's probably one of the patterns that we arrive with at birth. Like music, if you watch what little children do, they acquire language. Looks like spontaneously. If they're around people who talk, they just pick it up. They dance, they make images, they sing, and they tell stories before the age of 5. Nobody teaches them to do those things. They just pick them up. Reading is something you have to teach. We don't come with that program. It has to be hammered into you a bit more. So what is the advantage of being able to tell stories? Why did we acquire this? You can see what a handy tool it would have been, and still is. You could have said, right over there, Uncle George got eaten by a crocodile. Don't go swimming there. You didn't then have to go and try it out yourself. You didn't have to. You could get told by a story. You could get told by a story how to hunt the giraffe or whatever it might be, and you could get told an origin story, which just about every culture but one that I know of has. Where did we come from? And you could get told a story about protective spirits that were going to help you. A very encouraging thing to have. So I think it's very, very old. The novel is a pretty recent form, 18th century and further on. And that came about with an increase in the ability to write, and some of the first novels were in fact written by women. It's been something that women did from just about the inception of the novel. And one of the things that a novel is it's like a musical score. So like a musical score, it's black marks on a page. And it does not, a musical score does not become music until somebody looks at that score and plays it again. And each playing of that piece of music is an interpretation, and it's a unique interpretation. So with a book, each reading of a book is an interpretation, and it's a unique interpretation because the moment of reading is when this thing here turns back into a voice or into voices. And you, the reader, are playing those voices in your head. It is, in fact, the only form that allows you to see another person from inside. From inside, not from outside. A picture, you're looking at them from outside. A film, you're still looking at them from outside. But with a novel, you are playing that vocal music from inside yourself. And that's why I don't think the novel is going to go away anytime soon.
Would either of you like to comment on the novel genre, or shall we take a few minutes and open it up now for some questions?
Let's do the comment.
All right, okay. Yes, back there.
I have a question. I think you're all masterful writers, and I love all of your work. You've all talked here about how the past and home and nationhood has affected your work. But I'm specifically thinking of looking forward, and I would like to address the question specifically to Margaret Atwood. In The Handmaid's Tale, I always thought of it as a portent of things to come. I looked at the date when it was written, and it was a little before any radical movements concerning women took place or theologies. When you mentioned the Pilgrims and your cast, I was very taken aback because I never made a connection with the book with how the past affected you, only the future. And I was curious because in all three of your writings, I don't really see a focus so much on the future as I do on the past. And in this particular book, I would just like to ask you, were you thinking more of the past or more of the future?
All right. Some people take The Handmaid's Tale as a feminist work because women are in the forefront. It's actually a work about totalitarianism. Okay, I happen to have put a woman at the center of it, but if I had put a man, it would still have been a work about a totalitarianism. I set it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for two reasons. One, that was the home of the 17th century theocracy of New England. And number two, at the time I wrote it, it was also the home of liberal democracy in the United States. Number three, I just thought it was funny, but Harvard at first was not amused, but they've come around. I think my point, one of the points about it was, things can change very quickly anywhere, and I was tired of hearing people saying it can't happen here. You know, I never believe it can't happen here because, in a way, I've read too much history, and so that was one of the things. My rule for it was that I would not put into it anything that had not, in fact, happened somewhere, sometime. So there's nothing in it that I, in my twisted, gothic, dark, bloodthirsty imagination, made up. I brought things together in an unexpected place, but I did not invent these kinds of behaviors. The other thing is that the women's position that we see today in Western society is very, very recent, and it rests on very thin ice. And some people thought I was making a comment on other places in the world. I was actually making a comment on our own past. You don't have to go back very far to find these kinds of attitudes, laws, stipulations, and restrictions in Western society and Western European society. So you can't really write about the future. It doesn't exist yet. Dante didn't really go down into the inferno with somebody called Virgil. He made it up. So when you're writing about the future, you're really always writing about the present because you can't predict the future, really. There are too many variables. Something else might come in that you weren't expecting and change everything. So it was really my totalitarianism book. How would a totalitarianism look if it were in the United States? Premise being that things never arrive out of anywhere, out of nowhere. They're always built on something that's already there in the society. And in the United States, you wouldn't be able to come in and say, "Hi, my name is Bill, I'm a communist, why don't you all vote for me?" You know, it just wouldn't happen. But as soon as you have a cataclysmic social event, a lot of pressure, people will roll over about their civil liberties pretty quickly. And you just saw that. right after 9/11. So all who say it can't happen here, or how could this country or that country ever have behaved so badly, just take a look at that particular event, the Patriot Act, what happened then. Scary.
Thank you. Yes, you have a question here?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Koch. In Sea of Poppies, why did you end it with the revolt and not go one step further? What was the point?
Well, Sea of Poppies ends where it does because to me it actually has a sort of completeness. It's these two characters, Zachary and Diti, looking into each other's eyes and recognizing each other. So that's how the book starts, and that's how it ends. So I felt that as an artifact, as a structure, it worked, and also because I didn't know what happened next.
That's always a good thing.
There's a kind of built-in academic calendar, and I can see people moving around and shifting, and my organizers have told me we need to end soon. So we'll take one question, and then if you have some questions, you can come up afterwards. Yes, back there.
I'm curious to know from three very professional authors, what is your standpoint on the plague of e-books and everything? So is it
E-books.
E-books. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I must tell you, I'm not worried by the e-book at all. I think maybe we had the same kind of worries when we moved from chiseling our words on stones to writing them with a feather on a parch. People said, but we like this sound, it was so romantic. And if I may add to what Margaret so beautifully described before on the way you said why novel is not to be gone, because our material are abstract symbols. The phonetic alphabet in any language is a combination of abstract symbols. There is no connection with the Y and the sound it makes in your throat, and there is no connection between the word cow and the beast itself. It's a decision that this is the symbol, and the symbol remain the same whether they were written by a beam of electrons or by ink or by the chisel on the stone, and I think the story and the characters will not be affected by the e-book. And another thing is, if you allow me to write in a word processor, why should I not allow you to read with such a technique? It's the same thing. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to respond to that question?
I think actually it will cause an increase in reading because these things are quite cheap.
And we will save the forests.
Well, there's another bad thing that happens with the manufacture of ebooks, which we won't go into. But yes, the good thing about paper books is they are, of course, great carbon capture things, as long as you don't burn them.
And
yes.
Amitav will not be able to sleep in Burma with only one underneath his head.
Yeah.
I can assure you that we will continue to read you, whether it's on parchment or on a screen or e-books or whatever. And I want to thank you, first of all, for enriching our lives in terms of the books and our reading them in solitude and in stretching our minds. But there's, of course, something to be said for the presence of the author and your voices. And those voices will remain with us as we go on reading you. And we wish you many, many, many years of more books for us to read. And please come back.